So this is some of the most important elections in the history of post-war France, perhaps the most important election in post-war France. Emmanuel Macron, the president, has dissolved the legislature after he got a battering in the European elections. This may well bring, potentially, these elections could end up with a far-right government in power. Marine Le Pen, of course, is the far-right figurehead who in the last presidential elections got a much closer result than ever before. Equally, the left, contrary to some expectations, managed to come together with a popular front around a social democratic platform. But in the polls, the far right are ahead. Now, there's no better person to speak to about this than Stangler, who is a brilliant journalist based in France. He's the author of Paris Isn't Dead Yet. Do make sure you get a copy of that book, but also he's got another book he's working on with French editors at the moment. Hey, Cole, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
How bad is this really, I suppose? How serious is this in terms of what could happen? I mean, could you explain, because the French elections are quite complicated, I think, often for an international audience who aren't au fait with the electoral system. So I guess firstly just say, why did Macron call these elections? I think that'd be quite, what was the context of him doing that? Because some might look at it and think, even on his own terms, that was a slightly insane thing to have done.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people still think that. So as you mentioned, this call for the new legislative elections comes after the European elections, in which Macron's party did very poorly. More the far right list more than doubled the score of the Macronists. And so Macron didn't need to dissolve the National Assembly, but this is something that the president in France has the power to do under the Fifth Republic Constitution designed by Charles de Gaulle that gives the president quite a lot of authority. And so Macron, as a response to this very poor election result, decided to kind of take this extremely risky political gamble. Some wouldn't even really call it a gamble. They would say it's almost political suicide for the president. But that's what he's decided to do, and dissolve the National Assembly ahead of schedule. So typically, since recent reforms, the legislature, the National Assembly, has a 5-year term that coincides with the presidential election. So we were slated to have elections in 2027 at the same time as the presidential elections. Macron essentially is moving that schedule ahead and saying, let's have elections right now. And we have the first round coming up on June 30th, this Sunday, and then the second round coming up on the following Sunday. So the calculation here for Macron is really, I think there's a few different potential scenarios going on. One is that with his advisors, he genuinely believed that this gamble would pay off. He thought the left was not going to be united, which is what they've done. He thought that maybe by forcing voters to have to choose once again between the far right and his list, the kind of order versus chaos election, that he would come out on top. That's the election that he knows how to win. He did it in 2017 against Le Pen. He did it in 2022. And maybe that's one scenario. He really thought that was what was going to happen. Another, slightly more cynical scenario, and I'm sort of simplifying here, but one more cynical way of looking at it is Macron could have said, looking at the polls, the far right just did very well in the European elections. They look poised to do very, very well in 2027, the next presidential elections, with Marine Le Pen as the candidate. So, a more cynical person would say, well, one way of maybe blocking the far right's path to the Élysée Palace to winning in 2027 is to kind of maybe give them a shot at governing, whether that's either part of a coalition government, whether it's even letting them have a national government and rule in what's called cohabitation with Macron, to kind of have them, sully their kind of anti-establishment mystique and image by kind of exposing them to the kind of realities of power. Again, I don't favor this theory, but this is maybe one way of looking at it from the Macronist side. That's the more cynical way. Either way, extremely risky, extremely dangerous, because now we're faced with the very real prospect of the far right actually governing France within just a couple of weeks.
I mean, just on that, look, anyone wants to study European history and the history of the far right, I know, which I can't just transplant the far right of the early 20th century onto now, but there are some parallels. Quite clearly, we call them far right movements for a reason. Is the centre-right establishments of Italy and Germany believe they thought they would tame the far right in power, but they were brought to power by the traditional political establishments. The Italian Liberal Party thought they could tame Mussolini, for example. Now, I know there's lots of differences. I get that. But what strikes me is so insane about if that was, because various British liberals have said that, they let them have a shot at power, they'll mess it up. and then that's them done. Then people won't vote for them in presidential elections. But surely all that would happen is they'd come to power, and then they would blame everything that goes wrong on Macron. They would just say they're being blocked. That's the classic playbook of these people. They will just say it's a conspiracy against us all the time, and they just try and go for the most populist aspects of their program, like on pensions or something. Do you think that's fair? That's what they would do, isn't it?
Well, look, I mean, I think, it's hard to get too much into kind of speculation of what happens, because, I think it's a very different scenario having the far right actually have an absolute majority. If you imagine a government led by Prime Minister Jordan Bardella, who's the young kind of rising star.
He's 27. Yeah. 27, 28.
Young. Yeah. And, kind of unpolished, frankly, not, a great, not the most in command of the issues, but has this, very kind of manufactured candidate, really in the purest sense, has the great personal narrative and kind of has been thrust into this position. So, I think that's one scenario, having the far right actually have their own national government. That's what they want. But, they've also said they don't necessarily want to govern in a coalition with Macron. I think, what's clear is that this Macronist strategy of, because we've seen it before, this is kind of the ultimate expression of it, but the strategy of sort of kind of winking at the far right, using various borrowing themes from the far right, whether it's just rhetorically or even actually in the legislative arena, like this strategy does not work. We've seen it fail since the time of, going back, I think, to Nicolas Sarkozy. There's a very famous quote that you always hear, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine's father, who's still living miraculously, or who's still alive, the founder of the National Rally, National Front, Holocaust denier. He famously said, voters always prefer the original to the copy, and that's what we've seen. Macron's, one of the theories was, well, we're going to pass a strong bill on immigration. This is going to show that the government takes this topic seriously. It's going to, show to voters who are thinking about voting for the far right that actually know, the Macronists do care about cracking down on undocumented immigrants. We do care about protecting, French culture. What has been the result since that? Not very good. We've seen these various kind of attempts to engage in the kind of right-wing culture wars that the National Rally thrives off of throughout the presidency of Macron, talking about Islamo-leftism, the supposed scourge of Islamo-leftism, post-colonial theories being taught in universities. So again, both through the rhetoric, through the actual legislative arena, what is the result right now of these attempts to kind of play on the far right's terms? Well, now we're very close to having the far right actually be in government.
So we can see here a classic example of the political establishment in France thinking that they can diffuse the threat of the far right by moving onto their territory, but all they've done is shift the political conversation onto the very terrain most favorable to the far right and actually just boosted their chances.
Yes, absolutely.
Just in terms of, before I ask you, I want to ask you just about the nature of the far right and what that would actually mean in practice. In terms of the left, I mean, we have a Popular Front. There's a very long history. In 1936, you've got the Popular Front there in France, Léon Blum, the prime minister, an anti-fascist front. So that's what it's tapping into. I mean, how surprised are you that they got their act together, and how cohesive is that alliance? Because you've got Mélenchon, the more radical left, and then you've got the so-called centre left, but they've managed to coalesce. So just explain how the hell that happened and how stable that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable that they were able to do this against the advice of, against what Macron's brilliant advisors suggested that it was going to be impossible. But they managed to do it very quickly within 24 hours. And I think really it's because, don't underestimate the opportunism and the instinct for self-preservation, I think, that motivates politicians. I think people on the left, regardless of their political disagreements, and there are real disagreements between La France Insoumise and the Socialist Party, to take kind of the two extremes of this group. They rightfully saw this as really an existential threat. When you're talking about an election in which your camp risks losing dozens and dozens of seats in parliament, having representation in the national political arena, that is incentive for you to get your act together. So I think really they rightfully saw this as a kind of existential threat. Certainly a party like the Communist Party, which was is losing more and more support. Probably wouldn't have even had it, placed in the National Assembly if they had gone it alone. So I think there's kind of that self-preservation. That's a key thing, and that they understand this is necessary to even compete, to even have a chance at competing with the Macronists and the far right. The left absolutely needed to unite, and they did that. Doesn't mean that they're going to govern. We can maybe talk about what the path could look like. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. But that was kind of the first step. It was necessary. Today there are real differences. There are a lot of tensions between, again, you have people that are close to Jean-Luc Mélenchon who are running for re-election or running for seats, and you also have someone like François Hollande, the former socialist president, who presided over years of austerity, who presided over unpopular labor reforms, who even called for famously getting rid of French nationality for certain convicted terrorists, which is very, very controversial. So it's a broad camp. They've come to terms over basically a very simple list of economic proposals. So raising the minimum wage, repealing Macron's unpopular retirement reform, investing massively in public services, taxing the rich, very kind of bread and butter, common sense, left-wing economic proposals. Also on the international questions, they've been able to kind of reach the lowest common denominator, continued support for Ukraine, support for a ceasefire in Gaza. So, I don't want to deny those differences, but I think in the context, there is this tradition, like you mentioned, Owen, of the left coming together when there's the risk of the far right winning, the risk of fascism winning. The conditions this time, if we want to actually make that comparison to the 1930s, are far less favorable. Namely because the center this time is very, very hostile to this left-wing coalition. And I don't know how much detail you want to get into, because we could go into lots of granular detail about the problems and the tensions on the left. But I think for now, they've managed to sort of paper over them. But sometimes it spills out into the press. And maybe, I'll end very quickly just on this point of the left is also trying to navigate this media environment that is extremely hostile, more hostile than it's been ever really in the Fifth Republic, because you have, an increasingly well-funded, influential conservative media in France that is extremely hostile to the left. And every time there's the slightest disagreement, and I think you know this very well in the UK, these slight disagreements are instantly seized upon by people that are extremely hostile to the left. They'll blow them up. They'll talk about them in the press. And so it requires a level of discipline that the left needs to achieve if they want to win.
Justin, since you just mentioned that the hostility of the so-called centre towards the left, I mean, and the right, obviously the right-wing media, what's the kind of what's happening at the moment in terms of what that left coalition is, left to centre left coalition, what the sorts of attacks it's under, and how much basically firepower is aimed at the left for both the centre and the right compared to, say, Marine Le Pen's group?
Well, I mean, you have, the media will often, and there's the countless examples of this. I'll just talk about one that I saw recently of, having a socialist candidate, an influential politician, the Socialist Party, on television being interviewed about the left's program, spoke for, quite eloquently about the left's proposals for rejuvenating, the economy, for protecting the most vulnerable, really actual like political conversation. And at the end, you had two journalists who started asking them to immediately counter these, to discuss the fact that you have a radical left-wing candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, in this coalition, and to talk about anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism is a real problem in France. It exists on the left like it does everywhere in society. You also had a lot of critics, as you know very well, critics of Israeli policies, support for Palestinian autonomy and the people of Gaza, often get lumped under anti-Semitism at large. And this is something that has been used over and over and over again against left-wing candidates. And so this is a great example of a socialist candidate who's quite moderate himself, really, talking about this very sensible economic program. And then at the end, essentially being interrogated by supposedly objective journalists about why he didn't say anything about anti-Semitism. What does he think about Mélenchon, this dangerous firebrand who's part of the coalition? So these are really the two most common things. It's anti-Semitism, and it's how could you dare pretend to defend France's Republican values while you're aligned with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's seen as a dangerous firebrand.
In terms of the far right, I mean, they will the arguments they will present is we changed. You mentioned obviously Marine Le Pen's dad, who was a Holocaust denier. Marine Le Pen tries to distance herself from, he said the Holocaust is a mere detail of history, very infamously, and got prosecuted for that. And she says, well, we've changed. This is a new political party. She's rebutted the idea it's even racist. I know there was a recent controversy involving, a particular incident that was videoed. And so what, how dangerous are these people? Basically, how dangerous would you characterize them?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very dangerous. I think the rhetoric of the party has changed. The way they present the ideas has changed, but one needs only to look at the actual program, which they, it's not very detailed. The left's program is twice as long, but they do have a program, and I think you have to look at it. So one very simple thing, they want to get rid of birthright citizenship in France. France has this long tradition of birthright citizenship. So if you're born on French soil, even to foreign parents, you can acquire French nationality. The National Front wants to get rid of this. This tradition goes back in many ways all the way back to the 16th century, although it's been interrupted at different points. They want to get rid of birthright citizenship. And what does that actually look like in practice, too, for French people? Today, it means that you have to create a whole government bureaucracy for essentially determining whether or not someone is really French or not, forcing people to prove that their grandparents were French, because this is what it looks like in practice to change a tradition like this. So that's one thing, getting rid of birthright citizenship. They want to ramp up deportations of undocumented immigrants. This is in their program. That's very dangerous. So if you're an undocumented person, even if you have dual nationality or of a foreign descent, I think that's very dangerous if you look at their program. They want to impose what they call national priority. So that means in the Anglo-American world, we often talk about welfare chauvinism. That's what it is. What it means is cutting off housing benefits if you're not French, cutting off access to unemployment aid, cutting off access to different kinds of social programs that exist in France if you're not French. That's in their program. Finally, they also have talked about reserving certain jobs for non-dual citizens. So basically creating a new category of French citizens, which again, I don't think people understand just how serious of a proposal this is. You have to go back to Vichy to find something like this, where they're want to propose to create. So by reserving certain categories of jobs for only single French nationals, you're essentially saying you're creating different categories of French people who dual different categories of citizenship, which is a really radical proposal, which is what Vichy did. So I think there's a lot to be frightened about, because again, you hear certain people talk about how the RN is more economically populist, and we can deconstruct that. I don't really think it's necessarily even true, but one of the constants in this party, even though they've changed over the years, and they have, is look at the hostility towards immigrants, look at the hostility towards anyone who's even, a dual national, and the kind of coded way of looking at this too is even the French people who are, their parents might be French themselves, but if you're, a descendant of, if you have North African roots in your background, African roots in your background, if you're a French citizen, even if your parents are French citizen, you might not be really considered a full citizen according to the kind of RN's view of things, even if that's not exactly in their program itself. So I think it's extremely dangerous.
I mean, that point you kind of alluded to about them shape-shifting, and the far right often does shape-shift, because in Jean-Marie Le Pen's time, the father of the current leader, they were kind of neoliberals in the 80s. They had this backlash against François Mitterrand's kind of his left program. And then they kind of developed the rhetoric sometimes of the left on the economy. So what is that? You just mentioned economic populism. What does that mean in practice? And the other is just the danger of, I mean, you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary and how that just became a very authoritarian regime, and they look up to Viktor Orban. So I kind of wonder, is that their game plan?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really good question. I think everyone's asking what the game plan is. I attended, I covered a couple of their rallies, for part of my research for this book during the European elections. It's so hard to actually pin down what the RN wants to do in government, other than looking at the very clear, explicit proposals around basically targeting foreigners and immigrants. It's so hard to actually pin them down. I'll give you another example of this is, okay, so let's just to back up a second. Yes, they're less explicitly neoliberal than in the time of Jean-Marie Le Pen, but they're not progressive either. They don't call for actually raising the minimum wage. They don't call for investing in public services. Their way of sort of providing relief to low to middle income people in France is through tax cuts. So they're one of their signature proposals this time around is lowering the value added tax on energy, so electricity, fuel, and that really that does have some benefits for people, but we're talking about a tax cut. We're not talking about raising wages, investing in public services, or even raising taxes on the rich. They're opposed to reimposing the wealth tax that Emmanuel Macron famously repealed in his first year in office. The left wants to do that. And then I lost my train of thought there on this question of the economic program.
Yeah, I think because on privatization was that kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, they're not calling for actual socially progressive policies when it comes to the economy. Oh, and yes, I remember. So on this particular point around retirement reform, it's so flagrant. This is a classic example. Massive protest movement under Emmanuel Macron. Millions of people out in the streets protesting this hike in the retirement age from 62 to 64. The RN, opposed this rhetorically. They said they were against the hike in the retirement age, and now because they actually have a chance at governing France, they're trying to suggest that, well, maybe we can take another look at this. It depends if the state of the economy, if the finances make it possible to do this. We're not so sure. Last night, as we're speaking, so Tuesday night, during the televised debate on the televised debate between three candidates, the left, Macronist, and the far right, Jordan Bardella, the person we were mentioning, he suggested that actually, well, if you start work at 24, you actually shouldn't be able to retire until you're age 66. So now we're talking about going beyond actually the current law. So it's completely unclear. And this retirement reform example is a great example of how they're trying to kind of dance around these economic issues. And frankly, too, part of the problem is they're juggling this very complex kind of cross-class coalition between working class people. That's real. You have significant working class support for the RN, low to middle income French people. At the same time, the RN is courting more wealthy, extremely socially conservative voters who used to vote for the mainstream right, who do not want to hear people talk about getting rid of retirement reform or raising the minimum wage. And so they're really dancing around this. What is the kind of cement to this coalition? Like I said before, it comes down to hostility towards immigration, towards immigrants, towards celebrating French national identity. That is what unites this cross-class coalition at the end of the day.
Just finally, then, I mean, we have the first round on the 30th, and then of June, and then the second on the 7th of July. So I guess in that for that it matters how Macron's voters will vote, won't it? And the polling just suggests at the moment they're more hostile to the left than they are to the far right, which for those who believe in horseshoe theory is uncomfortable reading. But also just because Macron came out and warned of civil war, and when you ever hear a leader talking about civil war in the West, it's not something we're normally used to. I mean, there's that spectre raised in the US, which does sometimes look not unrealistic. So I'm just wondering how things will pan out in the second final round, but also when you hear this about civil war, how is that just ludicrous rhetoric for Macron?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think those comments you're referring to are sort of a last ditch effort to mobilize his electorate, because I think he's seen, if we subscribe to that first theory I mentioned, if he genuinely thinks he can mobilize his voters, it's clear right now based on the polling that the Macronists almost certainly are going to come in third behind the left and the far right. So I think it's an attempt to kind of scare his much older, wealthier base into voting. I think we can look at it in that sense more than anything else. But if you want to kind of game out what could happen after the first round, there's so many uncertainties. It's looking like that, given the participation levels, without going into too much detail about the way the system works, instead of having just face-offs between the left and the far right, in a number of districts, because of the increased participation, you're probably going to have cases in which presumably you could have three candidates running. So the Macronists wouldn't be disqualified because of the high level of participation. And then that becomes very interesting. Will those candidates withdraw? Will maybe some of them withdraw and support the left? Maybe some of them withdraw and even call for voting for the RN. That seems unlikely, but it's possible. Will some of them probably just withdraw and say nothing? These are all kind of uncertainties. And I think also the other thing to think about is we're moving more and more towards I think the gap, it might be increasing more and more between the president and the people even in his political coalition that might, wake up on Monday after this brutal first round and say, well, wait a second, why do we have to tie our political fortunes to this risky, to this president who's taking our country down an extremely risky, dangerous path? We don't actually need to follow him. So, and the left already, I think, is trying to court, and they have to be very careful about how they do this, trying to court the kind of more reasonable centrists that are still left, that actually see the far right as more of a danger to the republic than the left. And so the left is already kind of starting this work of trying to court what's left of the kind of reasonable Macronists. But I think it's such a hard question to answer. I think what is safe to say is after that first round on the 30th, we're going to see so much maneuvering, so many different statements. The Macronist coalition could implode. And anyone who tells you they know that how that's going to actually look in practice probably doesn't really know, to be perfectly blunt. There's so many uncertainties.
Well, sobering stuff, and another disturbing kind of insight into the rise of the far right across the Western world. Obviously, this isn't a France-specific issue. This is just a French manifestation of it, but it will have huge implications for the rest of Europe and beyond in terms of how well the far right does. Brilliant stuff. Please like and subscribe. Those watching, leave your comments. Love to hear your thoughts. But Cole, that was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Owen.